The very early Christians, of course, didn't have Gospels. They had oral traditions about Jesus. The Gospels got written quite soon. But in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, there were all sorts of other traditions and stories about Jesus, and gradually people came to say, yes, but these four tell the actual story of how God has redeemed the world and us through Jesus. And so these came to be the canonical Gospels, not because they were politically convenient. They weren't. People got killed for believing them, but because these were the ones that really told it like it was. Then from, say, 500 to 1700 AD, basically the church lived with that lot. But particularly in 1700, the church was perceived by a lot of people to be very heavy-handed and politically dominant and restrictive. And so people associated the story of Jesus that they found in the Gospels with that heavy-handed church. And then in the Enlightenment period, they started to say, hey, maybe if we do some historical research on these texts, we'll have a freer, easier, more liberated view of who Jesus was. So the first quest for the historical Jesus, from roughly the middle of the 18th century to the end of the 19th century, was a lot of people struggling this way and that with what happens if we forget what the church told us and try and put Jesus in his historical context. The results of that were so devastating that for a long time through the first half of the 20th century, most scholars didn't really want to go that route anymore and were studying Paul and the early church instead. Then after the war, Ernst Käsemann, one of the greatest German scholars of the period, said, this ain't no good, we've got to study Jesus himself, because if we don't do that, we will invent Jesuses to suit our ideologies. He had the Nazi ideology in mind. The trouble was the new quest which he launched never really got beyond agonized discussions about what criteria you might use and so on. There were some books written but didn't really get very far. Then with the new explosion of knowledge about first century Judaism, there's been a whole wave of studies, including my own, trying to locate Jesus within that. Geza Vermesch, Jesus the Jew, Ed Sanders, Jesus and Judaism, Paula Fredrickson, J.P. Meyer, Jim Charlesworth, a whole bunch of us. That's what I have called the third quest. Now, people get muddled about this because that's what I meant when I invented that phrase. But also simultaneously with that, we've had what Robert Funk calls the renewed new quest, which is what he thinks he and Crossan and people are doing. It's interesting that Funk agrees with me that that whole line that he's in, including the Jesus Seminar, is a very different thing from the third quest, even though many people have now used the third quest more loosely to mean everything that's happened since 1970. Now, I don't care about the phrase, I don't have copyright on it, but that's how it came about. But where we're at the moment, I think, is two significantly different movements. The Jesus Seminar, who have a Jesus who, as far as I can see, has only tangential relationship with first century Judaism, or the Jesus that I'm trying to describe, that Paula Fredrickson is describing from a different angle, Ed Sanders and many others, who has both feet firmly anchored in the world of first century Judaism, which was waiting for the kingdom of God. And we then find, surprise, surprise, that's the world described by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, not by Thomas or the others.